Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 497. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well, Connor. Got just another full week of news for everyone. I want to say like it hasn't slowed down in a couple months, but it really almost feels like 2 years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine that we almost haven't had a show where I felt like we didn't have more news to talk about than we had time for, and today is no different in that. So let's just jump right into it. Remind people they can find the show at the Libertarian Institute, where Connor's an editor, I'm the news editor. We put out a ton of great stuff in the news section of that site. Connor has a brand new article out just before we start recording this show that he'll be discussing on today's show. I'm also the opinion editor at antiwar.com. You can follow the show on Twitter at con_interest. And of course, you can find the show on YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee, and up anywhere you can listen to podcasts. Connor, let's get going. The first article we have here is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Ukraine takes credit for car bombing that killed politician in Luhansk. So Ukraine's CIA-backed military intelligence has taken credit for a car bombing that killed a politician in the Russian-controlled eastern city of Ukraine on Wednesday. A member of the local Russia-backed legislator in Luhansk and a former police chief was killed in his car outside of his house. He was born in the Ukrainian Oblast and joined the separatists who declared the creation of the Luhansk People's Republic in 2014, following the coup that ousted the former president Viktor Yanukovych. And so, Connor, I think this is just so important again because the narrative we get is that we have to defend Ukraine because these are the great democracy, and supporting Ukraine is about supporting democracy and opposing tyranny. And when we look at kind of the tactics that the Ukrainians use, well, if they were used by Hamas, we would condemn them as terrorists and say that this is why we have to support Israel. So an interesting hypocrisy there. Next, I got this quote from the Russian foreign minister, deputy foreign minister, Sergei Rabkov, about the Russian participation in the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. So recently, Russia announced that it had withdrawn from that agreement, and Rabkov just had a little clarification on what that means. He said, "We have confined ourselves to restoring balance. Once again, we have not gone anywhere further. Russia has not withdrawn its signature to the treaty, and it will continue to adhere to the provisions. There are countries that have neither signed nor ratified the CTBT. Among those who have not ratified it, the United States is not alone. We are on par in this regard with the United States and some other states that have signed the treaty but have not ratified it." And so Rabkov is just saying that Russia hasn't completely walked away from the treaty. They haven't changed any of Russia's policies on testing nuclear weapons. They have merely realigned their policy on testing nuclear weapons to be in line with the United States. Next up here, I have a quote from Rand Paul. He was in a committee hearing, and we had James O'Brien, the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, testifying, and Rand Paul slammed him and the State Department. He said, I think he actually called it a Department of War rather than a Department of Diplomacy. So a pretty sharp critique from the senator there. He said to O'Brien, that's Paul said to O'Brien, "Do you believe that Ukraine is going to push Russia out of Ukraine? They're going to push them out of Crimea, and that Zelensky's position that we will not negotiate until they're gone from Ukraine is viable? Would you think that as a superpower, we would be involved somewhere with encouraging negotiation? But I've heard nothing from you and nothing from anyone in your administration, frankly, that talks about negotiating. There are actually some who say that we're back to about where we started as far as negotiating. Tens of thousands of people died on both sides and we haven't been successful, but I only hear war and I don't hear diplomacy." And then there was some back and forth, and Rand Paul kind of finished out by saying, "I haven't seen any evidence that the Biden administration is willing to entertain negotiations to end the slaughter in Ukraine." And, I think the most important thing that Paul highlights there, Connor, is that even if this war, were to end up tomorrow, and Ukraine at this point would negotiate on the best terms that Ukraine could possibly negotiate on, not only have they lost tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of their own people, but they've also lost a good chunk of Ukraine that they could have otherwise negotiated to keep. Maybe the Donbass, the republics of Donetsk and Luhansk would have almost always been in a state of rebellion slash strong autonomy from Kiev, but still, at least Ukraine could have on the map drawn its borders around those eastern republics. But now they've also lost a good chunk of the country south, the area north of the Crimean Peninsula that Ukraine will never be able to call its own again. And so, it's insensible that the U.S. is still refusing to negotiate after they've already lost so much deciding to fight this war. All right, Connor, next up here, there's just this very crazy statement made by a U.S. official. And this is something that I think is so astonishing because this is something that an American official never would have said about Ukraine until it was true about Gaza. And so I think it's a pure propaganda move. So this is the article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. Officials say U.S. must assist besieged Ukraine and provide military aid to Israel. So officials from the State Department and USAID pressed Congress to pass a $105 billion spending package that will provide weapons to Ukraine and Israel. One Biden administration official said it was crucial to provide aid to Kiev because the besieged people of Ukraine are fighting for basic needs such as food, water, medicine, and electricity. Aaron McKee, Assistant Administrator for Europe and Eurasian at USAID, told the committee, the House committee, I believe, on Wednesday, the besieged people of Ukraine are fighting for their country's survival. As a democratic state, they are also fighting for basic needs such as food, water, medicine, and electricity. And so the statement is striking as it more accurately reflects the situation facing Palestinians in Gaza over Ukrainians. However, a Hamas attack in southern Israel on October 7th, Tel Aviv has maintained a complete siege of Gaza. Only a small amount of food, water, and medicine has trickled into the enclave. Additionally, communications and electricity have been cut off by Israel. Still, McKee and other Biden administration officials who testified at the hearing called for providing $14 billion in military aid to Israel. The aid for Tel Aviv would be a part of a larger spending package that includes $61 billion in assistance for Kiev, funds for a military buildup in the region surrounding China, and billions of dollars to spend on securing the U.S. southern border. The USAID official described passing the bill as important as the current funding allocated to Ukraine has nearly been exhausted. McKee said aid distributions would have to be cut to 75% soon. James O'Brien, the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that Ukraine is winning, is already taken back half the territory that Putin seized since February 2022. In September, however, the New York Times reported that Russia had captured more territory than Ukraine in 2023. The Ukrainian commander-in-chief, General Volushny, recently acknowledged that the war had reached a stalemate that Kiev is unlikely to win. The State Department official attempted to portray the military aid as benefiting the American economy, but was smacked down by Senator Rand Paul, who pushed back, saying that the money would only serve to enrich weapons makers. And so, Connor, it's just, I almost wonder if this is actually far more tactical than it appears, where this isn't just lazy, where they're trying to take some of the rhetoric that people are using about Gaza and trying to apply it to Ukraine, but maybe this is a way to actually kind of circumvent the narrative about Gaza getting out by using these words about Ukraine over the Palestinians. It's a way to maybe suppress it, like in Google search results and on Twitter and social media and stuff like that, where now if you're going to search, besieged country or besieged territory, you're going to get Ukraine to start popping up rather than Gaza. I'm not sure, maybe that's a
It's
little
pretty slick.
conspiratorial on my part, but it does seem to me like something like that may be going on.
They've
Uh,
done this before, by the way. I mean,
yeah,
in the May bombing on Gaza, the 11-day Israeli bombing campaign against Gaza, where they killed something like over 260 people, including several dozen children. A few days into the bombing, a State Department official said that, Xinjiang in China is an open air prison, and look at how they treat their Uyghur Muslim population. So if you were going into the search bars, like you said, and you were looking up open air prison, because of course that was scattered all over social media, especially like you're seeing now, a lot of people are discovering what's been going on in Gaza since the blockade was imposed now, because it's at the forefront of everybody's mind and in the top page of every newspaper, and at the it's always on the TV. So people are learning about this stuff now. And so a way to handle that, I suppose, in this very ham-fisted way, is to just come out and say, to use the key words, essentially, to, I guess, hijack the search results and to try and, yeah, like you said, it's almost I don't know. It's like you say. I don't think it's very effective, but I guess they're trying to draw some sort of moral equivalency or suggest that, they're
I think
standing
it
on the
might be
side of the
more
true
effective
victims.
than we would think,
Yeah.
just on the margins, maybe. Anyways, move on here. Next article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. Amid military surge, Pentagon lays out 4 military objectives for the Middle East. A Department of Defense spokesperson explained Washington's current goals in the Middle East since Israel launched its massive military operations in Gaza. The U.S. has deployed thousands of troops into large hosts of naval ships to the region. According to a press release outlining Brigadier General Pat Ryder's statement, the Pentagon's 4 priorities for the Middle East are protection of U.S. forces and citizens in the region, the flow of crucial security assistance to Israel as it defends against further Hamas terrorist attacks, coordination with Israel to help secure the release of hostages held by Hamas, to include American citizens, strengthening the foreign posture across the region to deny or deter any state or non-state actors from escalating the crisis beyond Gaza. And so, Connor, I think it's so interesting because I'm pretty sure the second point there, which is securing the crucial flow of assistance to Israel, kind of contradicts with the other 3. We've seen Israel really be unwilling whatsoever to negotiate with Hamas on securing the release of American prisoners. There were also hundreds, if not maybe a few thousand, dual American Palestinian citizens that reside in Gaza. I think the U.S. has said that about 400 of them have gotten out of Gaza in the past week. But, all these are American lives, or, people that America should be interested in, and yet they continue to give Israel arms unconditionally to bomb Gaza. So that's a little bit of a head scratcher. But back to my article here. On October 7th, Hamas launched an attack on southern Israel that killed over 1,000 people. Israel responded with a massive bombing campaign that killed 10,000 civilians, including 4,000 children in the past month. And I did see, Connor, that I believe Israel put out now a full list of names. It was, I think, 1,423 or 32 maybe. But in the lower half of the 1,400s, I believe was the list that Israel has put out so far. Now, of course, the number of Israelis dying is ticking up. I believe we're now in the 20s of the number of Israeli military personnel that have been killed inside of Gaza since they launched ground operations. President Joe Biden has traveled to Israel, and the White House has offered its full-throated support for Tel Aviv's military operations in Gaza. While American military officials have admitted that the Israeli operations have killed many thousands of civilians, the White House has refused to call for a ceasefire or condition American weapons transfers on Israel, reducing civilian casualties. U.S. forces in the region have come under attacks from local military groups that view Washington's support for Tel Aviv as crucial to the Israeli military operations in Gaza. Over the past month, various groups have conducted at least 38 attacks on American soldiers, injuring at least 45 troops. In response to the attacks on U.S. soldiers, the Pentagon has deployed more military assets to the region, including thousands of troops, 2 aircraft carriers, and a nuclear-powered submarine. Additionally, on Wednesday, U.S. Central Command announced it had conducted 2 show-of-force operations with B-1B Lancer bombers in 3 days. CENTCOM posted on X, for the second time in 3 days, a U.S. B-1 Lancer conducted a mission over the Middle East. Area of responsibility, U.S. F-16s escorted the bomber. The leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, threatened to attack the American ships in the region if a more expansive war broke out. He said in a speech last week, since the outbreak of war, the U.S. has threatened to bomb us in Lebanon from its ships in the Mediterranean Sea. We are prepared for whatever scenario. If an all-out war breaks out, you Americans will pay with your ships, your aircraft, your soldiers. And I think this is something else, that kind of points to a contradiction in the U.S. policy here, Connor, where the U.S. is pouring military assets into the region and saying that we need to protect American soldiers, where if you want to protect American soldiers from getting attacked, if you're moving from the Middle East, that's of course, really we're just putting more soldiers in harm's way and putting more targets out there for different groups to strike over how upset they are about what Israel is doing in Gaza. So I wrap up this article by saying, while the Biden administration has sought to secure the release of American citizens who are held hostage in Gaza, Tel Aviv has rejected pauses in the fighting to facilitate a prisoner swap negotiations. Now, I will mention, Connor, just before we recorded, I did see that there are now reports coming out, and I believe they are based on statements made by unnamed American officials, saying that Israel has agreed to do a 4-hour humanitarian pause, and they're going to do one of those 4-hour pauses over the course of 3 days to facilitate negotiations and for prisoners to be released. However, the Israeli president, Isaac Herzog, who isn't the most powerful person in Israel, so if he isn't the most in the know official, that's possible. But he did say that as far as he knows, no pause in fighting of any kind has been agreed to. Now, there's this really important statement that came out today, Connor, and Dave DeCamp has the report for us. U.S. officials say death toll likely higher than being reported. So the comments were made by Barbara Leaf, the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and a break from President Biden's claim of the numbers from the Gaza Health Ministry, and Biden said those can't be trusted. So this is what Leaf told the House Foreign Affairs Committee. In this period of conflict and conditions of war, it is very difficult for any of us to assess the rate of casualties are. We think they are very high, frankly, and it could be that they are even higher than are being cited. We will know only after the guns fall silent. We will take in sourcing from a variety of folks who are on the ground. I can't speculate on one figure or another. It's very possible that they are even higher than being reported. And Connor, this isn't surprising, but what we've been talking about on the show, the UN has been coming out and just blatantly saying that the number that the Gaza Health Ministry is putting out is a number of bodies that they are counting. And so that means there's more people under the rubble and more bodies that haven't yet been counted. All right, Connor, last article I have here today before I hand it over to you. I wrote this just before we start recording here, so this is hot news. Hundreds of journalists slam media coverage of Gaza for enabling Israeli massacre. An open letter signed by over 750 journalists, including some from mainstream Western outlets, slams the Israeli government for killing civilians in Gaza. The signatories condemn newsrooms for failing to give the Palestinians a fair voice and justifying the Israeli onslaught. The letter, signed by journalists at Reuters, the Los Angeles Times, Jewish Currents, MSNBC, Bloomberg, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post, blasts Israel for its devastating bombing campaign and the media blockade in Gaza, which threatens news gathering in an unprecedented fashion. The letter reads, as reporters, editors, photographers, producers, and other workers in newsrooms around the world, we are appalled at the slaughter of our colleagues and their families by the Israeli military and government. We are writing to urge an end to the violence against journalists in Gaza. The Committee to Protect Journalists reports that since the start of the military operations in Gaza, 34 Palestinian journalists have been killed. The group says the Israeli bombing campaign in Gaza is the deadliest war for journalists since the CPJ began collecting data in 1992. The military operations in Gaza have killed over 10,000 citizens, civilians, including 4,000 children. A State Department official said it was possible that the actual death toll was higher. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said on Wednesday that the high rate of civilian casualties shows something is happening in Israel. This is a quote: "When one looks at the number of civilians that were killed with military operations, there is something that is clearly wrong." The authors of the letter place some of the culpability on newsrooms for portraying the conflict from an Israeli point of view. The letter says, "We also hold Western newsrooms accountable for dehumanizing rhetoric that has served to justify ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Double standards, inaccuracies, and fallacies around the American publications have been well documented. Newsrooms have instead undermined Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim perspectives. They have printed misinformation spread by Israeli officials and have failed to scrutinize indiscriminate killing of civilians in Gaza committed with the support of the U.S. government." News coverage has positioned the October 7th Hamas attack as the starting point for the conflict without offering necessary historical context that Gaza is a de facto prison of refugees from historic Palestine, that Israel's occupation is illegal under international law, and that Palestinians are bombarded and massacred regularly by the Israeli government. The letter says that outlets should call Israel an apartheid state to accurately portray the situation the Palestinians face. The authors of the letter wrote, "We are renewing the call for journalists to tell the truth without fear or favor, to use precision terms that are well documented by international human rights organizations, including apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide." Several international human rights organizations have determined that Tel Aviv's oppression of the Palestinians amounts to a system of apartheid. Abdallah Fayed, a 2022 Pulitzer Prize finalist and former editorial board member at the Boston Globe, who signed on to the letter, said he hopes that the letter will cause editors to think twice about their language. His explanation for signing on to the letter was this: "My hope is this letter is to push back on the culture of fear around this issue and to make decision makers and reporters and editors think twice about the language that they use." Wrapping up here, the letter additionally touted the importance of the work journalists are doing in Gaza. It says, "We stand with our colleagues in Gaza and herald their brave efforts at reporting in the midst of carnage and destruction. Without them, many of the horrors on the ground would remain invisible." All right, Connor, I will hand it over to you.
All right. Man, that was a brilliant letter and it's very encouraging to see. I know that when they first put it out, it said 600 people had signed it. And in the interim, I believe 150 or more, you were telling me, have signed on since. And that's fantastic. Because oh my God, if you watch TV, it's just incredible to see all these people calling for war and demonizing all anti-war protesters is just, frothing at the mouth, anti-Semite, will soon to be Nazis basically storming the streets. But hopefully some truth will prevail here soon. So this article is about what's been going on in the West Bank. Bezalel Smotrich, the leader of the Religious Zionist Party, big key member of Netanyahu's right-wing extremist ruling coalition that came to power in December. He's demanding additional security zones be built around the illegal West Bank settlements, one of which he actually lives in the West Bank, which will prevent Palestinians from getting into these areas, but also it'll prevent them from harvesting their olives. And we've just been through the prime month of the harvest season, which is October. But obviously, there's still more work to be done. And this is just a very dehumanizing, illegal policy that's likely to be implemented, although it doesn't seem that there's yet been a response to his letter. He sent it to Yoav Gallant, the defense minister of Israel, and then Benjamin Netanyahu, who's the prime minister, of course. So as I write here for this piece at the Institute today, Israel's finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, the leader of the religious Zionism party and the ruling right-wing coalition, demanded Tel Aviv impose security zones around illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank on Monday. Now, the letter Smotrich had sent to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Gallant includes an insistence that Palestinians be kept away during the ongoing olive harvest season. So this follows a pattern of occupying forces and settlers exploiting the war on Gaza as an opportunity to further cut Palestinian towns, cities, and villages off from each other via more military checkpoints, cement blocks, iron gates, and earth mounds. So his letter reads, I demand that a written directive be issued immediately by the political echelon to the Israel Defense Forces to create those wide security zones around the settlements and roads and to prevent Arabs from approaching them, including for the olive harvest. Now, murders of Palestinians by settlers and soldiers alike in the West Bank are currently soaring, while apartheid Israel concurrently wages its unprecedented bombing campaign against the besieged Gaza Strip, killing thousands of civilians and children. It's unbelievable, but at this point, and the number is going to be higher than this probably by the time we put out the show, but at least 175 Palestinians have been killed and thousands more injured in the West Bank just since the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel. According to UNICEF, dozens of children have been killed and injured in the West Bank during the past month. On October 28th, Bilal Mohammed Saleh, the 40-year-old wild herbs vendor, was shot in the chest by a settler and murdered in front of his wife, his, I believe, 4 children, and several members of his extended family, including his uncle, while the Israeli military stood by and watched. This guy just got shot in the chest with a rifle. They were running away from the settlers who were getting ready to move in and attack them, and so they were running away. But he had dropped his phone. He turned around just to grab his phone. But as he was doing it, a settler from I believe 100 meters away shot him in the chest with his rifle. And they took him to the hospital. His family put him on a ladder and used it as a makeshift stretcher, but he died on the way. He was pronounced dead by the time he arrived at the hospital. So Bilal and his family were harvesting olives on land he inherited from his father. And just less than a dozen miles south of Nablus, in the village of I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Swaiya. The village has been progressively encircled by Jewish-only colonies or illegal settlements, as they're called typically. Now, Palestinian residents are only able to build and work on 5% of the 12,000 dunams that they own in this area. It's just a travesty. So the area has been terrorized for years by settlers. Nihad Anar, the village council head, told Al Jazeera, quote, they cut down our trees, burn our farms, steal our olives, and are known to assault Palestinians inside their homes and on their property. So as the Gaza war rages, settler attacks and murders on Palestinians, including those working their olive groves during the prime harvest month, have significantly escalated. So, for instance, Mohammed Wadi, whose father, we've discussed this case a few times on the show, but whose father and brother was shot dead by settlers during a funeral procession for 3 Palestinian olive growers killed by settlers a day earlier, told Reuters that although the settlers used to aim low at Palestinians in the past, quote, now they shoot to kill. So the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs says that since the October 7th Hamas attack and the war on Gaza began, settler attacks on Palestinians have more than doubled. For Palestinians, prior to this month, this year was already one of the deadliest on record, as we have been keeping track. Before the end of September, more than 220 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces and settlers, including over 36 children. And that figure includes 187 people who were murdered in the occupied territories, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and then also 37 killed in Gaza, mostly during a smaller bombing campaign back in May. So in March, Smotrich proclaimed that there is, quote, no such thing as a Palestinian people. And his party, along with National Security Minister Itmar Ben-Gvir's Jewish Power Party, support massive settlement expansion. It's the top priority of this coalition, or at least it was until the current phase of the war against the Palestinians began this last month. And ultimately, of course, they've declared repeatedly that they're moving toward the complete annexation of the West Bank. And additionally, Smotrich has endorsed illegal collective punishment policies and called for, quote, wiping out the entire Palestinian village of Huwara earlier this year. So with Smotrich at the helm, approving new settlements as well as the demolition of Palestinian homes, the Netanyahu coalition has set records for illegal settlement construction in the West Bank this year. As Mondo Weiss explains, quote, Smotrich holds sway over two ministries. The first is the finance ministry, for which he is directly responsible given his role as finance minister, and the other is a new position in the defense ministry, essentially making him the governor of the occupied Palestinian territory, and most crucially, making him responsible for settlement in the West Bank. So Ben-Gvir announced last month that Tel Aviv would purchase and distribute 10,000 assault rifles to Israeli citizens, including within the West Bank's illegal settlements. And according to Axios, the U.S. State Department is set to approve a $34 million sale of 24,000 M16 semi-automatic and automatic rifles after reportedly receiving assurances from Tel Aviv that the weapons will not be provided to the settlers, the civil defense forces, these different, as these groups are called. It is not clear at all, though, if Ben-Gvir is going to hold that promise. As he's personally distributed hundreds of rifles, I believe more than 300 to settlers just last month. And as we discussed last week, they're incorporating a lot of these settlers into various security forces who have some of whom have criminal records. So this is just obviously like pouring gasoline on a fire and pretending to be some kind of a fireman, which is what the U.S. is currently doing. And so, whether or not this policy that Smotrich is demanding these security zones, if this gets implemented, of course, the murders of the Palestinians and their dispossession is only escalating further and further as all the eyes are on Gaza, of course, because it looks like they're committing a genocide / unprecedented ethnic cleansing campaign here, preparing to potentially push 2.3 Palestinians off their land and into Egypt or wherever else they'll go once Gaza is made into a completely unlivable space. And then we'll see the settlers return. They were removed in 2005. The siege was imposed in 2007, and so it's very popular among the pro-right factions that support men like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu that they would like to see that they turn Gaza into a parking lot, flatten it, whatever, turn it into glass. And then they're going to move in and they're just going to build they're going to move in back with the military. And basically Gaza will become very similar to the West Bank. And it'll be just one more atrocity the U.S. government is responsible for. Okay, so speaking of that, there was another raid on the Jenin refugee camp today. And the numbers have gone up since this article was published over at the Cradle. I've seen estimates as high as 15 people killed out of this raid. But Al Jazeera is currently reporting that 10 people were killed, so somewhere between 10 and 15. But this is intense clashes rage in Jenin camp as Israel steps up raids at the Cradle for anybody that wants to read the article. So they write at least 9 Palestinians were killed and over a dozen injured during an Israeli raid in the occupied West Bank on the city of Jenin today on November 9th. So the Wafa news agency, a correspondent for Wafa news agency reported, quote, a large army force accompanied by a bulldozer stormed Jenin refugee camp as snipers occupied rooftops, and the bulldozer proceeded to destroy the roads and infrastructure. Israeli forces fired a missile into the camp, I believe targeting a building, causing multiple serious injuries, the agency added. For its part, the Israeli army announced that it carried out a drone strike against a, quote, group of armed Palestinians in the area. Now, the raid began at midnight on November 8th, triggering intense clashes between Israeli troops and resistance fighters. Fighters confronted the troops with high-impact explosive devices and gunfire. The Israeli raid persisted into the afternoon of November 9th. So The Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade said in a statement on Thursday morning, our fighters are still engaged in intense armed clashes with the invading occupation forces in the city of Jenin from several fronts, targeting them with heavy barrages of bullets and explosive devices, achieving direct hits in the enemy ranks. According to Wafa, Israeli forces targeted an ambulance with gunfire, injuring one of the medics. It added that the Israeli troops deliberately prevented medical teams from reaching the injured. This all sounds like standard Israeli procedure when they attack these refugee camps in the West Bank. So reinforcements of occupying forces continue to arrive in Jenin and its refugee camp amid the intensive presence of Israeli aircraft over the city and the camp. Back in that attack on July, that was the first in more than a decade, the attack on the Jenin refugee camp where they tore up the water and the electricity networks and tore up the roads with bulldozers and sent in well over 100 armored vehicles and drones and Apache helicopters and 1,000 troops. They killed 12 people, and including 5 children. And I believe it was the first time they had dropped a bomb in the West Bank in a raid like that in more than a decade, I believe 15 years. And so now it seems like it's becoming a much more common occurrence, especially now with the war in Gaza ongoing. And so Jenin has for years been known as a bastion of Palestinian resistance in the occupied West Bank. And of course, they reiterate this attack from July. That was, of course, aimed at rooting out resistance groups based there. But as our audience knows, that's you're only going to achieve the opposite effect whenever you carry out operations like this. Even the U.S. military, like General McChrystal, have admitted as much when they talk about insurgent math and things like that. So the Jenin camp has been raided several times since the outbreak of the Gaza-Israel war on the 7th of last month. Israeli forces also stormed Nablus early on November 9th in search of resistance fighters who had carried out a shooting operation southeast of the West Bank city overnight on Wednesday, which injured 2 settlers. Okay, so now this next story is about the U.S. launching more strikes in Syria, allegedly targeting an IRGC, allegedly targeting the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or a facility used by the IRGC. And this could trigger a massive escalation with Iran. So this is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com from yesterday on the 8th. U.S. launches more airstrikes in eastern Syria against IRGC site. Now, the Pentagon said on Wednesday night that the U.S. launched more airstrikes in eastern Syria that targeted a facility used by, quote, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated groups. So, quote, the strike was conducted by 2 U.S. F-15s against a weapons storage facility. And this is from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. In his statement, he said the strike was, quote, a response to a series of attacks against U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria by IRGC Quds Force affiliates, referring to the Shia militias that operate in both countries. God, this is just unbelievable. I know he just came off his seat over there at Raytheon, and Austin just has absolutely no honor whatsoever. But it's truly amazing to me, the hypocrisy and the willingness to just use American forces American troops as tripwire forces in this larger war that we're fighting on behalf of the Israelis. I mean, it's so ridiculous that our troops are still occupying Syria and Iraq, but now they're just sitting there waiting for this to become a much more expansive war. Because, of course, everybody knows that the U.S. is facilitating and managing this whole war against the Palestinians. Even if we don't have any real sway, the Biden and Blinken administration over Tel Aviv, it's still completely underwritten and co-bylined. Every last murder that happens in Gaza or the West Bank is just completely in our name and with our money and with our weapons and with our planes and with our bombs. And of course, now we're finding out more and more each week how deeply involved the U.S. is in these operations. But more on that here in the next story. So the U.S. Launched similar airstrikes on October 27th in an attempt to, quote, deter further attacks on U.S. forces in the region. But the rocket and drone fire on U.S. bases has not stopped. At least 41 attacks have been reported since October 17th, injuring at least 45 U.S. troops. And that's what they're willing to admit. So an umbrella group of Shia militias that calls itself the Islamic Resistance of Iraq has taken credit for many of the attacks on U.S. bases so far. The militias received support These Shia militias received some support from Iran, but it's unclear if Tehran is directing the attacks. Pentagon has previously acknowledged that they have no evidence of direct Iranian involvement. For their part, Iran has denied any role in these attacks by the militias on U.S. troops. Responding to U.S. allegations, Iran's representative to the UN said Tuesday that Tehran has never been involved in any actions or attacks directed at the U.S. military forces in Syria and Iraq. So there are no reports of casualties yet in the U.S. strike. I'm sure he's referring to the militias and not, actual Iranian strikes on U.S. bases following the illegal assassination of General Qasem Soleimani back on January 3rd, 2020, and in the days following that assassination. So there are no reports of casualties yet in the U.S. strikes. If the IRGC personnel were hit, it would risk a huge escalation with Iran. So Austin said that the U.S. urges against escalation, but it's unlikely the Shia militias will back down as the U.S. continues to support Israel's onslaught on Gaza. The United States is fully prepared to take further necessary measures to protect our people and our facilities. We urge against any escalation. U.S. personnel will continue to conduct counter-ISIS missions in Iraq and Syria. And, of course, all of the enemies of ISIS are the ones attacking the U.S. forces. If this is true, assuming that these are the Shia militias, and I think there's reason to believe that that's the case. You can't rule out because there's been instances where attacks on U.S. bases have been blamed on these groups when it's more likely that it was actually ISIS who was carrying out those attacks. But in this case, I think it's more believable. But regardless, these are not counter ISIS missions. These are, especially in Syria, this is ancillary to this brutal economic war against Damascus, a key Iranian ally, where we've put in, with the Caesar Act sanctions and stealing away, occupying a third of their country, taking their oil and their wheat. You got 90% of the civilian population living below the poverty line with limited access to food, water, electricity, transportation, healthcare, all these things that the State Department is so concerned about in Ukraine. They're depriving this war-torn population of, specifically until there is regime change. We will starve people to death and immiserate them indefinitely using the weight of the Treasury Department and an illegal military occupation until there is regime change in Damascus, even though we backed al-Qaeda and ISIS with our Israeli and Saudi friends and killed 500,000 people, but we didn't get the outcome we wanted. And so we're going to starve people to death instead and try the economic war route, which never works, but that's what they're attempting to do. And so Austin's just lying there again. Also on Wednesday, Israel launched airstrikes in southern Syria, and ISIS attacks were reported in desert regions, killing 26 members of pro-government militias and 4 Syrian soldiers. Okay, so this next story, the Houthis shoot down a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone off of Yemen. And this is from Dave again on November the 8th at antiwar.com. So Yemen's Houthis said Wednesday that their military successfully downed a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone that was flying off the coast of Yemen. A U.S. official later confirmed that the Houthis downed an American drone and said the U.S. was analyzing the incident. The Houthis, formerly known as Ansar Allah, have been firing missiles and drones toward Israel and say the attacks will keep up until the Israeli onslaught on Gaza comes to an end. In a statement, the Houthis said the U.S. drone that was down was deployed to back Israel. So we've been flying MQ-9 Reaper drones over Gaza, collecting intelligence for the Israelis, ostensibly to assist in these hostage recovery operations, although it's not clear how much of that is actually going on. It looks more just like a free fire genocide against the civilian population. And we know from Pentagon officials speaking to the press that they're not even close to taking out even the middle leadership ranks, let alone the higher leadership ranks of Hamas. Even if that was justified as a strategy, which I don't think that's an excuse to bomb a concentration camp indiscriminately or otherwise, but as an occupying power here. But regardless, they're not accomplishing. So either they're really awful at accomplishing their goals, or their goals are to immiserate and devastate and wipe out the civilian population, especially the children and the civilian infrastructure there in Gaza, which I think is obviously more likely. And so the Houthis said the Pentagon said in their statement, our air defenses were able Oh no, these are the Houthis. Our air defenses were able to down an American MQ-9 while it was carrying out hostile surveillance and espionage activities in Yemeni territorial waters as part of American military support for Israel. The downing of the drone raises questions about a potential American response. In October, the Pentagon said that a U.S. warship in the Red Sea had intercepted drones and missiles the Houthis fired toward Israel. So now there's collecting intelligence on any sort of forces that are preparing to, in Yemen that are preparing, the Houthis are preparing an attack against the Israelis in defense of the Palestinians. And so let's see. So the U.S. has backed the Saudi-led coalition against the Houthis in this brutal war in Yemen since 2015. And although a ceasefire has held relatively well since April of 2022, the U.S. Also has a military presence in Yemen, but it's unclear how many U.S. troops are stationed there. Nominally, the fight is against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula that U.S. troops are carrying out. The Houthis, of course, were briefly a partner of the U.S. in the fight against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula before the Obama administration stabbed them in the back in March of 2015, and then backed the Saudi-UAE coalition against them, which included al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula as well as ISIS, where in Yemen, the two groups are virtually indistinguishable. And so, yeah, it's just, I mean, it really makes you wish that there had been this, if fighting breaks out again here between the Houthis and the Saudis, I'm not sure that's necessarily, I don't think that's likely, but it is, of course, a possibility. It really makes me regret of course, that the House Democrats who promised that they were going to put forward a war powers resolution forcing Biden to commit that he would not support Saudi in a resumption of any fighting in Yemen, that was never taken up in any sort of serious way or even introduced. And so we'll have to keep an eye out. The Houthis are not going. They've been through a heck of a lot. 377,000 people died in that war. At least at the end of 21, by the UN's estimates, the vast majority of them were children and infants and children under 5 years old. But the Houthis are still willing to stand up for their fellow Muslims. It's actually pretty encouraging or heartening to see. This next story, this last story for today, White House says Israel will have initial security responsibility in Gaza after the war. So this is from November 8th as well from Dave at antiwar.com. The White House on Wednesday said the Israeli military would likely have to be responsible for security in Gaza initially after the war if Israel successfully roots out Hamas. Quote, I think all of us can foresee a period of time after the conflict is over where Israeli forces will likely still be in Gaza and will have some initial security responsibilities. And this is from National Security Council spokesman John Kirby. The comments are similar to remarks that were recently made by Netanyahu on Monday that Kyle covered on the previous show. He said that Israel will take over, quote, overall security responsibility in Gaza for an, quote, indefinite period after the war, signaling plans for long-term military occupation. Now, Kirby also warned against Israel reoccupying Gaza, saying it would be a mistake. Israel withdrew its troops from Gaza in 2005, but put the enclave under a military blockade in 2007 after Hamas came to power. The blockade was never lifted and gave Israel the ability to impose its complete siege on October 7th, keeping out any water, fuel, cutting the electricity, preventing any medicine from getting in except the drop in the ocean of aid that has gotten in since. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Wednesday warned Israel against occupying Gaza while acknowledging that there will be a transition period after the war. It is clear that Israel cannot occupy Gaza, Blinken said. Now the reality is that there may be a need for some transition period at the end of the conflict, but it is imperative that the Palestinian people be central to governance in Gaza and the West Bank as well. Biden administration officials have been calling for a two-state solution excuse me, after the war, but it's clear that that's not something the Netanyahu government is considering. And Blinken has absolutely no leverage, and this is all just PR nonsense. A leaked document drafted by Israel's intelligence ministry revealed that the Netanyahu government is considering cleansing Gaza of its approximately 2.3 million Palestinian residents by pushing them into Egypt, but the plan is strongly opposed by Cairo. Besides their plans for Gaza, the Israeli government has prioritized expanding settlements in the West Bank, and settlers have taken advantage, as we discussed earlier, of the current tensions to push Palestinians out of their home. Since October 7th, nearly 1,000 Palestinians have been forcibly displaced. So And that's really the plan, I believe, for Gaza. If they can push everybody into the south, maybe their goal is to push all the Palestinians into Egypt, into the Sinai Peninsula, but or as I said, any other regional countries. I mean, the way they treat these people, it's this it's so dehumanizing when people go, why don't they just go to Jordan, why don't they just go to Egypt, why don't they just go to Syria and Lebanon? So many of them already have over the course of this long-term ethnic cleansing campaign since the Nakba, but these people are willing to die for their land. They will not leave their land, so they're either going to die there, or the Israelis are going to make it so unlivable, turning Gaza into a hell that it is right now, and then push them out. And if they take the quote unquote initial security responsibility as well as the White House is, characterizing it, it won't remain initial for long. Obviously, it's going to turn into something very similar to the West Bank, and they're just going to build on top of this massive graveyard of children, women, and men who are being mass murdered right now and chopped to bits with American supplied munitions. They're going to build houses, and as a lot of people are talking about, a lot of these hawks in Israel, they're just thrilled with all the possibilities that they can, all the things that they can build on top of all these dead Palestinians, and how great it's going to be. But anyway, we'll be back next week, hopefully with some better news coming out of the Middle East.
All right, Connor, thank you for the update. And like you said, we'll be back with more news next week. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kyle.